Hi, listeners. Before I start the episode for this week, a quick note. I'm recording this on March 19th, 2020, and as you know, there's an ongoing global pandemic. And if you're like me, every media source and every social media post that you consume has been focused on this pandemic for weeks now. And I don't know about you, but that's not great for my mental health. I think it's a lot of people, it's beating us down. As with anything, a little information is very helpful, can help you stay safe, help you know how to respond. But then beyond a certain point, it's not so great. So, what I'm going to do with this podcast, I'm not going to do one or more episodes about the pandemic. Maybe once it's long past, I'll talk about it in retrospective, but for now, I'm going to continue with my regularly scheduled programming. We're going to talk about some enduring concepts in economics, and we're going to take our minds off the pandemic and the ongoing crises that have been sparked by it. Thanks for listening, and stay safe. You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. Hi, listeners. You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. I'm Garrett Peterson, and my guest today, returning to the podcast, is Garett Jones. Garett, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me back.
So, listeners, you'll recall Garrett's past episodes where he talked about his previous book, Hive Mind, and what was the the one on diversity was the other one, and you may recall them because they're some of the most downloaded episodes of the show and also the most controversial.
Glad a lot of people got to hear the ideas.
Yeah, and I think we had a good discussion about both of them online, so I was really happy with those and with the response to them, talking about some controversial topics, but in a mostly polite and thoughtful way.
And backed by generally mainstream academic evidence, stuff that's sitting in the journals, but that just hasn't made it out to the broader public.
Yeah, and on that note, your current book, 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust Elites a Little More and the Masses a Little Less, is very much in that same vein. You look at the title, and I think, it seems very, very edgy, very controversial, but the book itself is full of things that maybe people, definitely economists are not going to find particularly objectionable. And a lot of people might think, what, 10% less democracy, how can you say that? And then they flip it open and go, yeah, I already believed in a independent judiciary. Maybe I just never thought that in doing so, I was believing in a little less democracy.
Yeah, we could easily replace most of our Supreme Court decisions with mass votes, and almost nobody wants to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So there are topics we leave to experts who are appointed for long term. Sometimes they're not even really experts.
Yeah, it's like,
yes,
people are not consistent on this. It's so easy to just sort of, when you say like, we should do this because it's more democratic, and that's like the end of it. And and I think your book does a good job of treating that as the start of it. Okay, if something is more democratic, sure, that's something, but does that mean it's going to have better results? And you discuss the cases in which more democracy can be better and the cases in which more democracy can make things worse. So your book is interesting throughout, starting with the dedication. Do you want to tell me the backstory behind that? You dedicated the book to someone whose name you didn't even know.
Yes. So my first time actually talking on this topic was about 5 years ago at George Mason University. I gave a talk to a campus group, and it was a small little audience. And a student reporter showed up, and she wrote an excellent, excellent article. I couldn't have asked for a better coverage. And the title of the talk was 10% Less Democracy. And I outlined many of the themes that are in the current book, which is that, you know, macroeconomists, we know that central banks work better when they're kept further from the voters. I saw in the Senate that senators become politically cowardly and really kind of policy cowardly when the election gets closer. They have 6-year terms in the United States Senate. So they act braver the further away the election is. That was sort of a launching pad for the whole talk. So it got very good coverage in the student paper, but then a couple days later, a lot of very partisan media pieces came out saying that here's a professor saying that we really need less democracy. These elitists are trying to tell us what to do. And it doesn't really matter which political side the argument was coming from, because it just depends on the year, right? But I, for the first time in my life, I received a torrent of internet hate mail, a lot of curse words, people telling me I should be fired. And then the climax of it came a little bit later when somebody left a voicemail on an anonymous campus number, or on a neutral campus number, one of these general numbers that we have. And so for the first and only time at Mason for me, I received a call from the campus police. And so I called back, and the officer on the other line tried to explain to me what had happened. It said that someone left a very unpleasant voicemail message about me. And the officer asked if there was anybody who might be particularly mad at me. And the way I put it in the book is that I had an idea, and that idea became the book. So realizing that people were passionate about this topic but misunderstood it so thoroughly, is part of what made me realize that this would be a good topic for a book, because that was a sign that there was going to be some audience out there. I didn't know if the audience would be big or small, but some audience that was interested in this question of what kind of government works well, and what happens when we stop worshiping this icon of the word democracy and we start looking at the actual governments that we like, that we as normal people like, and then take that to the next level and see what people who've studied this stuff like. So in stage one, we realize that we ourselves usually don't want everything to be voted on in a plebiscite. We don't want our politicians to have 1-year terms, which is the most that the ancient Athenians would trust somebody with in general. We like to have politicians with a little longer link, a little longer of a looser control between the voters and the people running the government. And since we like that normally, it seems like we should test out just how good those things are. So, and I think that a mixture of our intuitions about what makes for good government and decades of good social science seem like they'd be a good foundation for a book like 10% Less Democracy.
Yeah, I like that you in the intro and just now brought up ancient Athens, because it's like the test case of really extreme democracy.
Yes,
where you're voting on absolutely everything, and your leaders are elected to extremely short terms, and maybe they get recalled in the middle of that, and just the kind of crazy things ancient Athens did, like invading Sicily in the middle of a war with Sparta,
exactly. And
maybe
killing
wouldn't have happened if they were.
Socrates.
Yeah, exactly, right? Maybe they would not have done those things if they had been a little bit more like our modern democracies, having maybe a little less control by the voters and a little more independence of elected politicians and appointed judges, etc.
Well, I mean, the Athenians they make a lot of good points when they argued for keeping close control of politicians. There's an obvious insight that, it's a public choice insight that's associated with my department at George Mason, which is that if you let government officials do things on their own, they're just going to rent seek and try to pull a whole bunch of resources to them and their buddies. And that might not be for the common good, right? So the ancient Athenians, the ancient Romans, they tended to have a lot of systems in place to try to make sure that public officials didn't abuse power for their own selfish ends. And so, we should be worried about whether moving away from our current level of democracy, which is a mix between democracy and oligarchy. If we move that slightly more toward oligarchy, we should be worried that bad things could happen. But part of what I do in the book is I show that where we can check for evidence and where people have tried to kick the tires hard on the evidence, we see that the benefits of moving toward a little bit more oligarchy, as the ancients would call it, seem to have pretty high benefits and pretty low costs.
Right. And you're so one thing you talk about a lot in the start of the book is like, how do we define, a democracy? What makes a country more or less democratic? And a lot of people will sneak in, to their definition of democracy, not just like, oh, there are elections, people are voting in them, there's a meaningful choice, but also something like, oh, and it guarantees the country guarantees human rights, which of course is not so much democracy as
for all.
That's just good, or depending on your perspective, that is sneaking in a measure of like how the government governs into your definition of democracy, and you try to get away from that. So tell me about that.
Well, I really try to focus on democracy in a very narrow definition, which is fairly direct voter control over the government, either directly through plebiscites or indirectly through elected officials with fairly short terms. Both the ancients and modern democratic philosophers both knew that longer terms were less democratic than shorter terms, that making politicians come back to the voters frequently was one way to make sure that the politicians couldn't run the government in a way that was against the wishes of the voters. So I really do try to keep this eye on voter influence over the day-to-day operations of government. And a lot of what we like in our modern democracies, because I don't try to quibble with calling our modern governments democracy, right? By and large, I just let that language stand. But the modern things we call democracies have a lot of undemocratic elements, and we like those a lot. Like you mentioned before, independent judiciary, judges with long terms who can't be fired by a president who's unhappy with their decisions, independent central banks, independent regulators, a powerful bureaucracy that's kind of hard for the president to slow down or for the prime minister to slow down. Some people would call that the deep state. I would call that an independent bureaucracy. And these are all elements of good policy that, on average, we appreciate, and they're not fully democratic.
Yeah, and just getting the people to accept, like, if you can get people over that hurdle of, look, you already believe in many things that are non-democratic and are uncontroversially good.
Yes.
Then it you can get people in the mindset of, okay, well, exactly how much democracy do we want? And you also talk about how having very low levels of democracy, having an authoritarian government, has very, very bad outcomes, like democide and uncontrolled famines, that the famous Amartya Sen argument. So your argument is targeted at the wealthy, successful, highly democratic countries, and you're definitely not saying that any of them should get anywhere close to that level of authoritarianism where there's simply no democratic control or very little.
Exactly. I think that there's something like a democracy Laffer curve, where there's an optimal level of democracy. It might vary by country or by the situation, might vary based on policy regime, but that 0% democracy is bad news because in the last century or more, all of the world's famines have occurred in countries that aren't democracies, that are not functioning democracies. It's a little bit of a caveat. I won't go into that here, but basically, if a country is a democracy that has a government that can function, it has not had a famine. And this is famously true for India, where India's last famine occurred right before the British left. When India was a colony, it had famines. Once India became a democracy, even though it was flawed and extremely poor and regrettably very socialist for a long time, it stopped having famines. It had chronic hunger, it had malnutrition, it did not have acute health crises caused by the lack of food. And that's an incredible miracle. And whenever I can get miracles like that, that's a miracle that's on par with the miracle of the invisible hand of the market. And I should sign up for that. So there are other elements in which democracies seem to have just having a low to moderate level of democracy is all you need to get these big benefits, like nearly eliminating the risk of democide, of a government killing its own citizens, nearly eliminating the risk of famine, and probably reducing the risk of war. So, yeah, a low level of democracy, a low to moderate level of democracy can get a huge amount of benefits. Beyond that, I think that's where it takes more data and more time and more care to assess, like, do we want to move to 100% plebiscites on everything? And there, I think that's where the data takes some time. And so that's where I spend the rest of the book, is the more nuanced cases for a little bit less democracy in the world's rich democracies.
Mm-hmm. So one way you make your point, several different times and in different contexts, is by showing how politicians behave differently when there's an upcoming election, or when
Yes.
they're under the sort of the threat of a looming and close election. Do you want to talk about the different contexts where, first, the different ways in which politicians change their behavior, and also the different contexts that's been studied?
Yeah, a lot of calls for, oligarchy or giving elites more power or technocracy are really calls for saying the wrong people are in charge and let's put the right people in charge. We've seen some of this in Silicon Valley's complaints about the way public health officials have responded to the global coronavirus epidemic. Part of their story is the public health people have been bad, they were wrong, and we, Silicon Valley folks, we knew the right thing early on. So let's change the people. It's always worth asking whether we should change the people. I'm interested in a way more economic issue, which is if I hold the people constant and just change the incentives, do I get different outcomes? And fortunately, as a former Senate staffer, I got a chance to see this up close. In the Senate, as I mentioned before, in the United States Senate, senators have 6-year terms. And we all knew that the same senator behaves differently when the election gets closer. Hill is in cycle. We say that when a senator he or she is in cycle. And we saw this. Everyone knew this. So this is literally a case where you are holding other things equal and just changing the timing of the election. So the best study of this that was done years after I left the Senate was one that I actually suggested to some grad students, although I didn't pick up the idea, but it got published in the Journal of International Economics. I saw a similar idea in the Journal of International Economics. Turns out that senators are a lot more likely in the United States to support free trade deals when they are more than 2 years away from election, and they're less likely to support free trade deals when they're less than 2 years away from an election, when they're in cycle. It turns out the difference is 10 percentage points. And as it turns out, as the authors point out in a footnote, Hillary Clinton herself perfectly exemplified this trend. In her first term as the United States Senator from New York, she voted for every single free trade deal in her first 4 years, and she voted against every single free trade deal in her last 2 years in her first term. So senators know that voters are not crazy about free trade. This is something my colleague Brian Kaplan documented in his book, Myth of the Rational Voter, which I strongly recommend. And it turns out that senators behave just like you'd expect if they genuinely fear the voters. If you're super cynical, you might think, hey, politicians can just ignore the voters. They just run a few ads, shake a few hands, kiss a few babies, and then senators just do whatever they want. Voters really don't keep track of what's going on. Turns out that politicians act like they do. So not only do they vote less for free trade, senators actually backload the pork into their states so that it shows up more in the last 2 years and less in the first 4 years. There's a nice study in the.
Can you define pork in this context?
Oh, pork. Good. Thank you. The pork would be like spending for very visible projects back home. Things like roads, bridges, hospital expansions, school funding, expanding medical research labs. anything that you can really see, anything that a senator can show up to and cut a ribbon and give a speech when the thing opens up. So senators only have, it seems, so much oomph, and so they do what economists call intertemporal substitution. They try to shift the payment, they try to shift the money coming back to their home states to the time they need it most, which is right before an election. So they act like the voters have short memories. And this is a lesson that we should keep in mind when we consider how much we should trust the voters with the awesome responsibility of controlling the government. Politicians act repeatedly as if voters have short memories that don't last more than a year or two on average on most issues, and politicians act accordingly. And you should ask yourself, do you want the people with the supreme power to control your government to only have 2-year memories on most issues? My answer is no. So I think voters are a useful check on the abuses of government, but putting them as the only person in the driver's seat is probably a mistake.
Mm-hmm. And so one suggestion that someone might get out of this is maybe other government bodies like the U.S. House of Representatives, which has elections every 2 years, so everyone is always in cycle. Maybe they should move to 4 or 6 years between elections if we want them to just be a little more farsighted, be thinking a little more big picture for more of the time.
Yeah, that's one thing that many reformers have mentioned this over the decades for the United States. I mean, the U.S. is a real outlier on this with only 2-year terms. In fixed term settings, 4 or 5 years is much, much more common. And it would be excellent, I think, for the U.S. to move in that direction. Parliamentary systems is always more complicated because the government controls its own power to set the election time, which it's a little hard to tell whether that's more or less democratic. I lean on balance toward calling that less democratic because you're giving the government the power to choose when to face the voters. So I think that's a good strength of parliamentary systems. But for countries with fixed terms, any country with 2 or 3 year fixed terms should really be pushing toward the median, the global median of 4 or 5 year terms. A little bit more distance between voters and government doesn't seem to create that many problems that are noticeable that have been documented to my knowledge, and they seem to generate real policy reforms that are the best.
Right. And so the another example you talk about is when the IMF bails out a country, when they offer a government loans to help them deal with a crisis. One thing they'll ask for is labor market reforms, which are another example of something that most economists agree. Liberalizing your labor market, on the margin is helpful in general, grows the pie of economic activity and value, but are very unpopular with the public. And you mentioned in a very interesting study showing that when the IMF is making these deals with countries, they tend to ask for less labor market liberalization when there's an upcoming election, not because the IMF is up for election, but because the people they're bargaining with are up for election and can't afford to make reforms that are unpopular in the short term, but probably good in the long term.
Yes, this is a case where I make my case here, partly drawing on surveys of European economists, because I know that if I just keep quoting American economists all the time, people will think I'm just a typical neoliberal hack, which I am. But what I am also glad to point out is that European economists are in very broad-based degree of power and the wisdom of labor market reforms, labor market liberalization. They tend to agree that it grows the pie, and they tend to have a more, not a strong consensus, but a moderate consensus that it tends to help the worst off workers quite a lot on net. So yeah, the IMF country gets in a financial crisis. It wants to borrow $2 billion to smooth things over while it reforms things. And the IMF likes to come in and give people some advice. They like to give them some medicine so that they can get better over time. And they're giving the standard medicine of labor market market reform. And so you would think that people would welcome good advice from their doctor, stuff that's wisdom that's passed the test of time, the test of experience in economics. But it turns out that's not the case. The more sensitive a government is to the voters, the less likely it is that the government will take an IMF package that demands a lot of reform. So it looks like the IMF, which people think of as this one of these all-powerful multinational agencies, is itself afraid of the voters. It's only two steps removed from the voters in any of these crises. It's lending money to a government that in turn has to respond to the voters. But the IMF lacks the ability to give governments, to give citizens the best possible medicine, especially when those governments are close to an election. To me, the big insight of that study is just that the IMF is afraid of the voters. To me, that's very interesting, that it doesn't have the power to jam things down a country's throat. It fights back against a lot of narratives about the all-powerful IMF.
Yeah, you wonder if maybe the governments that are dealing with the IMF really like having someone outside of themselves who they can blame. Like, look, we didn't want to do this reform. We had to because they made us, when really maybe they did want to. And it's a way of sort of tying their own hands in a way that they could excuse, the voters could excuse. But even so, they know that they need to. It doesn't give them the full freedom to enact unpopular but necessary reforms. One concern,
especially when the election is looming,
yes,
right? Especially when an election is looming. Looming elections seem to create worse policies in the U.S. when it comes to international trade, and they seem to create worse labor market reforms when it comes to cross countries. This is pretty widespread. So this isn't the only evidence I've got in the chapter.
Yeah, and it makes sense if voters are short-sighted and they care about the policies that you have enacted just in the last in the few quarters before the election, what they can see you doing, but they also care about economic growth leading up to an election mainly. And so if you can enact a policy that helps economic growth in the medium term, but is on its face unpopular, you want to do that right after you get elected, so that by the time the next election rolls around, economic growth is good because you enacted the policy, and the voters have mostly forgotten about the policy itself, which they didn't like, even though they didn't like because they didn't understand. So it kind of, there's sort of a logic to this that makes a lot of sense in terms of how politicians make their decisions in the context of a short-sighted electorate.
Yeah, in the Federalist Papers, which were written in the period just before the acceptance of the United States Constitution, Federalist Paper number 63 actually made a very similar, closely related point, which is that one of the strengths of the United States Senate with its 6-year terms is that politicians could start a project, and a long-term project, the kind of long-term projects that can help make a nation really better. And then 4 or 5 years later, it can start bearing fruit, and then they can go and show it to the voters and say, hey, look, this thing that I told you that would be kind of hard, we're actually doing it now, and it's turning out pretty good. So you want to give just long enough time that politicians can have an incentive, at least, to take on long-term projects that they can show the voters. And economic reforms, the kind you've just mentioned, are one example of that. Certain kinds of infrastructure reforms that people would have talked about in the late 1700s would be another version of that.
Right. So the proposals we've talked about are, that flow out of the book are, longer terms for politicians, independent judiciary and central bank. And those are all things that exist currently to some degree and, in many places, and are not particularly controversial.
Yeah.
Another thing you mention is giving more weight to more informed groups of voters, sort of gerrymandering the electorate and giving people who understand issues a little better more say in who gets elected, or if there's a referendum, what policies get directly enacted. This is the epistocracy idea that I associate with Jason Brennan. You want to talk about that a little?
Yes. Well, Jason Brennan's work is very easy to recommend. I encourage people to take a look at his book, Against Democracy. He's a professor of philosophy over at Georgetown, teaches in the business school there. And he generously blurbed my book, you'll notice in the back. And but part of what I do in my chapter on epistocracy is, well, the most important decision I made with the chapter is what I entitled it. I entitled it, "This chapter does not apply to your country." I point out in the chapter that the American Medical Association says that doctors shouldn't treat their own family members. And similarly, I think when we give thought to the important topic of voting reform, we should think about it with a little bit of distance. Imagine some other country enacting the reform first. And maybe don't even do anything that's in the chapter. Just think through the consequences of having slightly more versus slightly less informed folks in the voting. But then the next thing I do is another very 10% less democracy thing. It's again something that happens all throughout the book, which is that I show the very things that people think could never happen and would be abhorrent if they ever happened anywhere are actually happening all the time. My favorite version of this is happens in Ireland. So in the Irish Senate, 10% of the seats, 6 seats in the Irish Senate, are set aside, and the only people who can vote in elections for those 6 seats are people who graduated from Ireland's 2 best universities. If you made that proportional to the US, that would be roughly people who went to the top 150 or 200 American universities, and it would be the top 20 to 30 universities. So,
okay, so that includes me. So I like it.
That would include you. Well, but remember, the point I make is that we're not saying that we want to make sure that exactly the right people are going into the voting booth. It's not about number 30 ranked Canadian university versus number 31 ranked Canadian university. I want people to think of this more like setting the voting age at 18 versus 19, right? There's nothing special about turning 18 or 19 that makes you magically wise enough to vote. It's that there's got to be some standard. So, and there's some argument, a good argument, for having folks with certain traits eligible to vote. And so if, for instance, the extreme version of this I talk about in the book, you would say, is that I say that many countries do not know what to do with their upper houses anymore. So whether it's the U.S., in the U.S. Senate, there's a little bit better of an understanding of it compared to a lot of other countries. But in the House of Lords, in the Senate of Canada, these organizations keep getting weakened, partly because nobody knows what to do with a quite unrepresentative body like that. So they have some veto power, they have some delaying powers. That's even the case with the Irish Senate. So my proposal is to actually give these upper houses that exist all throughout the world something useful to do, and turn these senates, which are houses of the old, taken literally, into a sapientum, the house of the wise. And so we could, in fact, just turn these entire organizations these entire bodies into something where all of the people who are voting in elections for these senates would have to have some kind of education requirement or an age requirement or both, for instance. So you could say one is allowed to vote in a sapientum election if one has a college degree or equivalent or has reached the age of 40. That's just an example of the kind of reform one could introduce. On the other end of the spectrum, it's also important to note that I draw on a European Union document, which reports that over 24 countries in the European Union say that if one has severe intellectual disabilities, one cannot vote. And I quote the document at length so that it's clear just how this case is made. So people with severe intellectual disabilities are either totally restricted or largely restricted from voting in dozens of the rich democracies. And when governments argue for why they keep people with intellectual disabilities from voting, they don't argue that it's because people will get hurt on the way to the election or that they might be abused in some way through voting. Instead, they make the case that one needs a certain level of information. It's useful to have a certain level of information about society, in order to be able to contribute usefully to a democracy. So just reading these documents that are used to argue for voting restrictions of various degrees for the intellectually disabled, what you see is that there is already a widespread consensus on at least some minimal degree of epistocracy, rule by the informed. So that means that most of us are just arguing about the details, about where that exact cutoff should be. I would like to reopen that debate, and I would like societies to find their own way to set the right cutoffs, the best cutoffs for them, not perfect cutoffs, but cutoffs that will help give a more informed, more long-run focused vision of the electorate.
Yeah, I really like the idea of having some kind of knowledge test. I know it would be hard to agree on, but if you gave, the political parties running for the election, if you gave them, vetoes over any sort of questions so that you didn't have anything, too likely to, so you didn't have a question that eliminated all of one party's voters, deliberately or something like that.
Yeah, that would be terrible, obviously. Horrifying.
Yeah, and it just like, and I'm sure we could agree on some kind of like really basic, like, you should be able to multiply two numbers together correctly. It's something really simple, that just, or you should be able to name, the, so I don't know, the first president or prime minister of your country, or just, or something that that doesn't skew in any particular direction, but just has people who are really really not informed, who just give them a little bit less voting power, maybe not even, maybe just weight the votes according to how well people do on a really simple knowledge testing quiz.
This is Brennan's approach, right?
Yeah.
Brennan's approach is that one could weight votes, and so everyone would have a vote, and then it would be his version would be that some votes count more than others based on the level of information. Since my book really is about 10% less democracy, not 50% less democracy, I don't want to advocate a purely epistocratic reform or even something that goes halfway to epistocracy. Instead, I try to do things like just, it really should, any epistocratic reform I suggest should feel like tinkering, at least most of them. So, for instance, I point out that if we used a high school diploma cutoff in the United States, that the major ethnic groups in the United States all have very close to about a 90% high school graduation rate. So there would be on that basis in particular, a high school diploma cutoff would not have a first order racial bias at the broad categories that are usually discussed in America. By the same token, I point out that in Canada it would, because there, according to Canadian sources I point to, First Nations individuals have an exceptionally low high school graduation rate. So high school cutoff there would be much worse than 10% less democracy. But in the U.S., at least at first glance, and even a second glance, it looks like a high school diploma cutoff for voting would not have a substantial ethnic realtering of the party of the electorate. So I point this out in a few other countries. I point this out for Japan. I point it out for the U.S. I point it out for the U.K. I point it out for Canada, just to give people a sense of what these kind of reforms look like on the ground, and that sometimes they are as horrifying as you think, but sometimes, as in the case of the UK, the US, and Japan, they are probably they'll probably end up with an electorate that in many ways looks like the status quo. So a high school diploma cutoff for all elections would not have the first order effects, the horrifying changes that many would predict. A little look at the data can often address a lot of our concerns.
Yeah. So those are the proposals in your book that exist somewhere in the world, that are relatively, that have been made by other people, and are, if we, epistocracy is maybe a little out there, but longer term limits really is totally a mainstream sort of proposal. You also have some proposals that are more speculative. So, for instance, you talk about potentially giving government bondholders a say in how a country is run. So, do you want to well, first, why bondholders, and then how would you give them a say?
Well, people who invest in governments in the long run actually do already have an enormous influence over what our governments can do. And so, unless one believes in that it's an incredible priority for all countries to pay off their entire national debt as soon as possible, then we've already decided we want to have outsiders, foreign investors, having an influence over what our government can do. So, as usual, we're not at the 100% or 0% levels. We're already somewhere in the middle, where we're letting people who buy government bonds, people who invest in our government's long run futures, we're already letting them have an influence over our government. So we should ask, is that good? Is that bad? How can we improve that influence? And so here I draw on Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, in his writings on the U.S. public debt, said that people who are government bondholders are typically people of wisdom, people with a focus on the long run. And indeed, I think the evidence suggests that that people who hold, say, United States treasuries that are 10 years or longer, UK gilts that are, say, 10 years or longer, these are folks who have an interest in our government's financial long run in a way that very few of our politicians and almost none of our voters do. So my question is, how can we give these folks a little bit more of a voice in how our government is run? I do give some evidence that governments around the world are already interested in pleasing their long-term investors, their long-term bondholders. And so I say, how can we formalize this a bit? I think the best way to do it in the short run is for there to be formal councils of bondholders who meet on a regular basis, say twice a year, with the finance ministries or treasury departments of the rich countries, and hold something like the equivalent of a G7 summit or a G20 meeting, where they propose various resolutions for how they think what policies these governments should enact to improve their long run fiscal position. On some level, governments are like businesses where they bring in revenues and they pay some costs, and what's left between those is a form of profit, and that gets returned to the bondholders in the form of interest payments and eventually principal payments. So these governments don't literally have shareholders in the conventional sense, but bondholders are the closest thing, and we should make use of the best thing we have on the ground to bring their long run voice into the councils of power. Again, I think like maybe twice a year meetings with the Treasury or the Finance Ministry with some formal resolutions is a good idea. More speculatively, I suggest that maybe 10% of the upper house could be dedicated to seats chosen by bondholder representatives.
Right. So in our current system, bondholders or people who, potentially could be buying government bonds have some influence informally through the level that they're willing, the amount of bonds they're willing to buy and at what price. So a country that is a country that is behaving irresponsibly, that is sort of has exploding public debt, that is unlikely to pay off those bonds in the future, gets punished by having higher lending rates, having to borrow at higher rates, having more difficulty, financing deficits. But you would make that so the bondholders currently have that influence that, but you would make it more formalized. You would bring them into the discussion on policy, and have them have their voices heard in a more explicit way, which and I can see governments doing this, especially if they didn't have any legislative power, but just had a voice. I could see governments doing this just because it would potentially mean that they could borrow at lower rates by setting bondholders' minds at ease.
Yeah, I mean, when a country gets into a financial crisis, it realizes that the bondholders really are an unofficial branch of the government. And as so often in my book, what I'm arguing for is to take these implicit forms of governance that are sitting around there and make them explicit. The governments we call democracies today are actually shaped by at least three big groups. One is the voters, one is the elites running the government, and one are these investors, often international investors that we call bondholders. So they're all shaping how government runs. And I'm arguing for giving a little bit more influence to the elites and quite a bit more influence to the formal influence to the bondholders, who have a lot of soft power now, but making some of that power more explicit, some of that influence more explicit, will save us trouble when crises arrive.
Yeah, and okay, so I'd like to see that in the future. I don't know if it'll happen, but it'll be interesting to watch. One other thing you talk about is giving more influence to party insiders. I think everybody in the 2016 U.S. election, everybody watched how the Republican Party, which is extremely democratic, was taken over by someone who the party elites did not like, and against their objections. Because the party is so democratic, the voters were able to overrule the party, while the Democratic Party did the opposite. A lot of voters did not like Hillary Clinton. A lot of voters did like Bernie Sanders, and the party managed to torpedo him. And I think you know, it really depends on what your perspective, but I think that is a pretty good case to me that that party insiders are not so bad. I don't know if there's anyone out there who prefers both Sanders and Trump to Clinton and not Trump. So it's at least a mixed bag.
Definitely. Yes.
Mhm.
Um, Jonathan Rauch really inspires one of the chapters in the book. And I actually, it's entitled Jonathan Rauch, Prophet of Political Realism. He's a scholar of Brookings, a great journalist. And he has a free book, about maybe 50, 70 pages long, called Political Realism. And I totally recommend it, like an afternoon's read. And he makes the case for more backroom deals. I think the line that he uses somewhere in there is the worst thing about the smoke-filled rooms where all the deals used to happen is that they were filled with smoke. But other than that, a pretty good idea. Sunshine. When I know it just I've been around the world long enough that I know that when you have sunshine laws that say that all the big meetings have to happen in public, all that means is that there's a real meeting that happens before the meeting, and that meeting is held in private. So that's not always the case, but we shouldn't expect too much from sunshine laws, and we might expect some bad things to happen. Sunshine laws that say that all the big decisions have to be made in public. So yeah, whether it's parties deciding on who's going to lead them into a general election, or whether it's a bunch of politicians deciding how to divide up the pork barrel politics, the pork barrel spending in some bill. A lot of these deals are better made privately, and then the voters, if they don't really like it, they can kick the politicians out. Hans Knoll of Georgetown has co-authored a great book called "The Party Decides," and it was about how in the U.S. Party elites really do have a lot of soft but large influence over who becomes the presidential nominee. Donald Trump, of course, is a huge exception to that rule. But this year, we've seen the party decides theory coming back with a 5-star rating, with the very quick triumph of Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders. Party leaders started making it clear. Voters changed too, so we can't be sure that this was all insiders doing it, or even doing most of it. But the quick switch away from Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden, a lot of that appeared to be driven by party insiders making it clear where they wanted folks to go. So
Yeah.
this can be good for democratic governance. It can be particularly good for high quality governance.
Yeah, what people are talking about is in the uh, 2020 election and the primaries are just people who still had a shot dropping out
Yeah.
and endorsing the centrist candidate, presumably because of some kind of backroom deal. They were offered something. They were offered, maybe VP nomination or a cabinet position or something that they wanted, and so they dropped out. Whereas in the Republican 2016 primary, people held on for much longer and were not able to coordinate around one non-Trump candidate. I want to say that in Canada, for listeners who are not familiar, I know, although I'm Canadian, that most of my listeners are in the United States. In Canada, the parties have a lot more influence picking their leaders, so you don't have any sort. The prime minister cannot ride a wave of personal popularity, or populist kind of populist politicians don't tend to make it to the stage where they're running for prime minister, because the parties choose who they want, and you gotta play the political game. You've got to be you got to be in a backbencher for 20 years, and then do what the play nice within the party, and then you get your nod 20 years later. And we had our someone trying to ride that populist wave in 2016, or that happened in 2016 with Brexit and Trump. We had Maxime Bernier, who was a previous guest of this show, actually, before his populist turn, and he lost his own seat. He didn't even, the party sort of quashed him, and then he went and formed a third party, which of course was always doomed to fail. So yeah, Canada is sort of an example of a system where the parties have more influence, and they often stop the voters from even getting the chance to vote in a populist candidate. And
yes,
so
this is
for good or for ill, that
yeah.
Canada is maybe an example of what the U.S. could be if the parties had more influence.
Yeah, so parliamentary systems do have this strong undemocratic element, which is that the party itself is powerful and it can allocate a lot of perks and help you move up the ladder. People often think of proportional representation systems as being obviously far more democratic, but there's even more gamesmanship going on in terms of who gets on the party lists. So as some of your listeners will know, under proportional representation systems, each party presents a list of candidates and they're ranked. And if you're the first person on your party's list and your party gets enough votes, then you will get a job in the legislature. If your party gets quite a few more votes, maybe the second or third person on the list will wind up in the legislature, and so on down. So there, the jockeying occurs behind closed doors off the stage for who gets in the ranking on the party lists. So PR system has its own kind of quiet backdoor oligarchy, and parliamentary systems likewise have a form of closed door oligarchy going on. So it does seem as though the equilibria we've established in the rich democracies all seem to have some element of what Jonathan Rauch calls political realism, and it's often pretty functional. I'm not an expert on parties. That's why I downplay that part of the book. I point people toward the wisdom of Jonathan Rauch as I should. But this equilibrium seems to exist in a lot of very well-governed places.
Mm-hmm. So we're running up on time here. Do you have an overall sort of message for someone who's listened to this conversation? What's the big takeaway from these ideas?
I think the big takeaway is a point that I've come to in the conclusion, really, which is that for literally thousands of years, people have debated what a good kind of government looks like. And, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Polybius, these writers all thought that good government was probably going to be a mix of democracy with oligarchy, some kind of blend, at least in a lot of settings. And the American founding fathers came to much the same conclusion when they were, after their experiment with the failed Articles of Confederation, when they moved toward the Constitution. And since then, it's been much less common, especially since the French Revolution, to openly celebrate the absence of democracy in any form of government. It seems as though there's this terrible default, and I think a very dysfunctional default setting, where we call whatever it is we like about modern governance democracy. But the ancients and the writers of the Enlightenment and the writers of the Renaissance, all of them, I think, were on a better path, where they were more open and more candid at getting the right balance between oligarchy, ruled by the few, and democracy, ruled by the many. And my goal is to continue that conversation, but using the power of 21st century data-driven social science.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if everyone listening will agree, but we'll have a good discussion, I'm sure. Garett Jones, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me back. Always a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Economics Detective Radio. If you want to buy a copy of the book, it's 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust Elites a Little More and the Masses a Little Less by Garett Jones. I'll have a link to that at economicsdetective.com on the show notes page for this episode. And if you want to discuss this topic, you can join the Facebook group. That's Economics Detective on Facebook. And you might have noticed that at the start of this episode, I actually introduced myself. I said, I'm Garett Peterson. I have not been doing that through most of the show, but I decided maybe I should start. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm at Garett Peterson on Twitter, and and I'm on Facebook as well. But and you can find me in the Economics Detective Facebook group. I think it would be nice to hear from some listeners. Maybe add me on Twitter, and you can discuss. I post each of the show episodes on Twitter, so you can discuss them there as well. Thanks, and I'll be back soon with another episode. Stay safe and stay healthy.